Hello again. Le programme reprend avec la table ronde régionale Amérique du Nord de l'UNEP-FI. Le thème aujourd'hui est le rôle de l'assurance dans l'adaptation et la résilience pour la société et pour la nature. Today's session, as part of the UNEP-FI Regional Roundtable North America, will be about insurance. Elle sera modérée par Butch Bacani. Butch is Program Leader, Principal for Sustainable Insurance for UNEP-FI. Je vous souhaite une bonne session.
Hello, everyone. I'm Butch Bacani from the UN Environment Program. Thank you to everyone for joining today's session about advancing the role of insurance in adaptation and resilience for society and nature. I'm joined today by an excellent panel: Mike Peterson, the Deputy Commissioner on Climate and Sustainability at the California Department of Insurance; Mandy Dennison, the Director for Social Impact, Sustainability and ESG at Intact; and Moira Gill, Assistant Vice President for Environment, Government, and Industry Relations at TD Insurance. I wanted to frame this session first with a few big picture slides. So if we can move on to the next slide, that would be great. So the big picture on climate change is that the latest science is showing that we are way off track from meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, the goal to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. At the moment, the latest UN report also shows that if you add all the climate policies of governments, we are going to be on track to 2.7 degrees warming by the end of the century. Let's go to the next slide on why that is really worrying. The next slide shows that in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change already issued a report that every half degree of warming is a world of a difference. So everything is worse if you move from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, whether it's extreme heat, sea level rise, crop yields, fisheries, etc. And so given the fact that we are on track right now to 2.7 degrees, that is catastrophic climate change that we are facing. So if you go to the next slide, and this is the reason why it shouldn't only be governments, but the private sector, including insurers, are raising their ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit it to a 1.5 degree scenario. So you have alliances on net zero insurance and net zero investment, which aims to reduce emissions in the real economy so that we can keep the 1.5 degree target alive. Next slide, please. And this is the reason why insurers can do a lot of things like project into the future using different climate change scenarios and see how they can help communities become resilient and their own businesses become more resilient. If you go to the next slide, at UNEP, we are working with insurers and the wider society, for example, in building a resilience of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. In the advanced economies, we're working with the California Department of Insurance to help make California more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So which brings me to the last slide, which is about what are we going to discuss in this session. Climate change adaptation or coping with the physical impacts of climate change is the focus of this session. That is the other side of the same coin of climate action, where the other side is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I've already showed to you that insurers can play a role on both sides of climate action, be it reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or in this case, coping with the physical impacts of climate change and building resilient communities. So our focus today would be on that side of the coin, which is about adaptation and resilience. So if we can move on to the panel discussion, that would be great. We can bring down the slides right now. So the basic concept right now that we have is that given the scenario of climate change, if 1.5 degrees is what we're shooting for, and we are already feeling the impacts of climate change at 1.1 or 1.2 degrees. So it seems like things will get worse before they get even better, if they get better. And that's why building resilience and adaptation is absolutely essential on climate action. So let's start with our colleague from Intact, Mandy Dennison, to hear her thoughts on what's Intact's thinking on how it can support resilient communities through its insurance business. Mandy?
Hi, and thanks so much for Butch for hosting this panel, and super pleased to be here. And I think you painted a really good picture of how we need to work on collective efforts to transition to a net zero carbon economy. But at the same time, we have to start doubling down on adaptation and adapt to extreme weather impacts on climate change because we're experiencing it right now. We need to outsmart extreme weather rather than chase it. And we believe that Canada's got a real unique opportunity to build on our credibility in this space, to lead on accelerating an adaptation at home and on the world stage. And we need immediate and aggressive deployment of adaptation measures. In the last year, about 40% of global severe weather losses were insured. That leaves significant economic losses that'll be borne by governments, communities, and businesses. And interestingly enough, fire losses with a value of greater than $10 million didn't actually exist in Canada before 2003. And since then, we've had 5 of them, with the largest being the largest, costliest disaster in Canadian history, obviously being the Fort Mac fires. And then for those that are joining us from outside of Canada, unfortunately, we've had some experience with fire this summer with the village of Lytton in BC and the Lytton First Nations, whose communities were pretty much decimated by fire this summer. So there's an urgency that we need to place on this and place on it now. Now, I realize this is probably a bit of a doom and gloom way to open a panel. But like I said, Canada's got a real opportunity to play a leadership position here. But this, Butch, you were bang on. This doesn't fall on government alone. This is an all of society approach that we need to mobilize on resilience, with insurers playing a very key role. And we see kind of 3 different dimensions of where society can play and where insurance can leverage its expertise. The first being in future-proofing critical infrastructure. Things like our electricity grid, water distribution, roads, and food supply, they form the backbone of our lives, but yet are pretty vulnerable to the impacts of severe weather. And much of this infrastructure, particularly in Canada, has been underfunded for decades and will fail if overloaded by a severe weather event. The Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, the last one, found that 30% of water infrastructure in this country are either between fair and very poor condition. And our friends at the Federation for Canadian Municipalities are asking for billions of dollars from the federal government to be able to protect municipalities from what's to come in the short term. And so we need to, mobilize and use our expertise as risk managers to mobilize that funding in the right way, focus on the right places, and which leads to my second point around needing to build right the first time and in the right places. And there's, I think a misconception out there that it's, more expensive to build right the first time, when in actuality, it's more expensive to retrofit and build back. Studies have shown that for every dollar invested in disaster mitigation, it generates about $6 in future disaster costs. So there's a real economic business case there in resilience and prevention. And insurers know better than anybody what happens when you build on wetlands and floodplains. And you know, the fact that we need to, you know, have stronger, better land use planning on that front. We have solutions here, particularly in Canada, and we can talk a little bit about that through the panel. But particularly on flood resiliency guidelines for new communities, existing communities, you know, retrofits in place, fire guidelines through Fire Smart Canada. There's an entire infrastructure there. We need local officials to have the resources and the political will to implement them. And then the third dimension is, and again, I won't go into this too much detail, but is natural infrastructure as the first line of defense. You know, wetlands and the preservation of wetlands can reduce flood damage costs upwards of 40%. You know, they keep our cities cool, and we need to protect the natural infrastructure we have. Canada and North America is a wealth of wetlands and, you know, unmitigated forests. And so we have to protect what we have and restore what we've damaged. Now, governments, particularly in Canada, have, you know, made some really great commitments over the past year, but we need to see this happen in a more rapid sequence. We need to leverage the expertise of the financial sector and insurers in order to do that. And we just see this as good politics, a smart business strategy, and an imperative for communities.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mandy, for those initial thoughts. I'm gonna ask you a question based on what you've said. So I think it's very important what you said about being climate smart before you build. But a lot of the things that we are experiencing right now are legacy issues. We've already built stuff where it's maybe not the smartest thing to do. So what are those concrete things that we can do when we have to deal with legacy issues where it's going to be very hard to relocate folks? So what are the things that we can do, the insurance industry in particular can do to actually help those communities become more resilient when we are faced with this? And I totally understand going forward, you want to do that and be smarter, but we have legacy issues, right?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And there are, as a part of the work that, you know, we've done and we funded with the Intech Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo, and you'll hear some about you know, what those practical solutions are in the next panel. So I want to also be careful that we're not getting too far ahead of ourselves, but there are certainly activities and infrastructure pieces that we can take a look at now, and taking a look at subterranean infrastructure and making sure that we're bringing those up to current standards and that they're built with kind of the future in mind, and retrofitted with the future in mind. You know, I'm sitting in downtown Toronto, for instance. I'm at the corner of University and College for those that are from Toronto, and University Avenue is just about to get ripped up and its infrastructure replaced as a part of kind of routine maintenance, as an example. And so we're challenging to say, is it future proof? Are we looking this with it? Like, we're looking to the future in mind on that front. And, you know, the Intech Center has a lot of research that, you know, anybody can use. Their work is free and available on the internet at intechcenter.ca for anybody who'd like to use it. For us to be able to kind of use those retrofits. The government has also started to make commitments on resilient retrofits, just like there's already a infrastructure around home energy retrofits. There's a dimension of resilient retrofits that we need to operationalize as well. And some of these things are super simple things that we need to do in order to protect our communities, like managing stormwater drains, for example. When we know a storm is coming, go out and clean it, as an example. You know, moving your downwater spout, you know, further away from your house, and have it drain further away from your foundation. Like, there is infrastructure pieces in place that we can operationalize. And as insurers, it's our opportunity to be able to educate our customers and educate our communities on how simple these activities are to build resilience. And, you know, from the Intech perspective, anyways, it can mean savings on your premium of anywhere from 5 to 15% if you take those actions. So there is incentive to, you know, activate on resilience measures.
Yeah, Mandy, you know that you were quoted there with the 5 to 15% savings
I
on
know.
premium.
I know.
Right. Let's go over to Moira and see what the thinking is at TD on resilience, Moira.
Thanks so much. So it has certainly been a tough summer for climate news. Forest fires, heat waves, violent storms. It's a clear proof point that climate change is here now, which aligns with the sobering news from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which you mentioned at the beginning, and the dire code red for humanity warning that due to our past inaction, extreme weather will only get worse. This is all very depressing, but actually for me, I think it's really a call to action. You can balance all of this bad news by understanding that we can still take action to address the worst impacts of climate change. And I'm really proud to say that TD Insurance is among the leaders making a difference in this space. We're working hard to embed a focus on customer and company climate risk resilience into our operations, and also to create external conditions with government and other stakeholders to allow us to achieve these goals. Mandy touched a little bit on how, as insurers, we have unique insight and information into the climate risk conditions of our consumers and of our communities. And perhaps we have an obligation, as well as most certainly an opportunity, to help both these groups manage those risks and work together to take steps to make communities and our customers more resilient. So we've taken a number of different steps. I'll highlight a few. TDI is a founding member of Climate Proof Canada, a broad coalition of organizations and environmental groups. And we're calling on all levels of government to prioritize climate defense and to better protect people and communities from the present and worsening effects of climate change. There's real progress being made. One of the most important, I think, is at the governance level. And I think that governance can drive a lot of change. So there's real progress towards a national adaptation strategy for Canada, which will advance comprehensive and inclusive approaches to make our communities more resilient to the changes in the climate we're already experiencing. I'd also highlight our work leading the development of a roadmap for Canadian Principles of Sustainable Insurance signatories to address ESG issues with all levels of government and with other relevant stakeholders. I'm firmly convinced that collective action is essential to deal with the immediate effects of climate change and moves towards resilience, as well as to address longer term changes. One company alone can only do so much, and what we can do together collectively as an industry is really going to make fundamental change. I'd also like to mention that climate change isn't just a general insurance threat. TD Insurance also has a life insurance portfolio. And there's definitely connections between events that hit our general insurance portfolio, so the catastrophes that impact homeowners, and the catastrophes impact on individual life insurance customers. And there's also, in many cases, impacts that are direct to life insurance customers that don't impact the general insurance portfolio at all. So the Canadian Medical Association is warning that extreme heat, for example, experienced this summer in Western Canada, and wildfire-related evacuations and increased respiratory distress across the country demonstrate that the climate crisis is no longer a vague future threat. It's here now, and its impacts are inequitably distributed. There's also a clear social aspect to both climate change and resilience. Often the people who are hit hardest or who are having the most difficulty being resilient in the face of climate change are those who already are struggling socially and economically. And I think it's important that we draw that connection and address that. And what you mentioned, the insurance gap, and I think that's an important approach to look at as well.
Thanks, Moira. Moira, that's a lot that PD is looking at, not only you as a company, but also looking at the industry. And it's also thank you for distinguishing that there's other lines of insurance affected beyond general insurance here, and extreme heat really is something that's becoming more pervasive, not only in North America, but if you look at Australia, for example, that's also another place where that's a real issue. Can I just ask one question, Moira? Because there's something that you said that chimes in with what Mandy said about the whole of society approach. There seems to be a growing recognition within the insurance industry that this is not cannot be even if the entire industry comes together, it won't be enough. So you are looking at engaging with government on this. So can I just ask, is government listening? Is heeding the call, be it at the national or the local levels?
I would say so, especially from what we've seen this summer. Some of that attention is driven by consumers. And because we had an election this summer, it was driven by voters. Mm-hmm. For the first time, climate change was a key issue in the election. And not just climate change, but climate resilience. I think partly it was the backdrop of the forest fires, the heat waves, the violent storms. It's something that can't be ignored. But I think I want to give credit to those of us who have been talking to government. And it's not just the insurance industry. We have been partnering and working with groups right the way across the spectrum of stakeholders who are interested in this issue. And I think that together with consumers, we've been successful in making this a top political issue. Every major political party in the last election had elements of climate resilience in their election platform. That was not something that was even considered. That was not top of mind at the last election. Now it's table stakes, and I think that's critical. And now the challenge, of course, is now that the election is over, to hold those platform commitments to account, both for the government in power and those who made commitments and who are now in the opposition. So that's our challenge moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Moira. So let's go to government then, and go to the U.S. West Coast, where Mike Peterson is as the first ever Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability in the U.S. So Mike is pioneering in different ways. But Mike, there's a lot of work in California on climate, both mitigation and adaptation. But there's been a lot of really interesting outputs in your work there. Do you want to share that with us on the thinking and the regulatory perspective, and why you're working with market participants on this?
Absolutely. Thank you, Butch. I appreciate the chance to be on this panel. And I wanted to pick up on a couple things to start with that Moira and Mandy had mentioned. You know, I mean, we do see in California, like there is around the world, this growing protection gap and the need to try to close the protection gap in order to facilitate climate resilience just generally. But then at the same time, you know, looking at the climate impacts that we see, there are many different avenues that this impacts people, that this impacts communities, and this impacts the insurance sector. And so finding those sort of localized solutions to this global problem is also a challenge that we're trying to solve. And so, you know, as you highlighted in your slide earlier, the Department of Insurance under Commissioner Ricardo Lara released a climate insurance report earlier this summer. That was a collaborative effort amongst 18 climate insurance working group members, and really focused in on how do we take a fulsome look at resilience and insurance's underappreciated role in that resilience. And to do that, you really have to kind of look upstream from the insurance policies themselves at how do you define the risks and assess the risks? How are they communicated? How do you reduce the risks? And then what within that can insurance do to strengthen the resilience for our communities? Because without greater investment in risk reduction and more effective tools for risk management, the communities here in California and across North America are going to be in this feedback loop where you have accelerating risks, increasing losses, fewer insurance options, and abilities to recover. And then you're backslid to the point where it's harder to then achieve emissions reduction goals and also to be resilient for the next storm or fire or heat wave. And so if that feedback loop intensifies, who's left behind? Our most vulnerable communities are the ones who will be left behind, and that growing protection gap then becomes a major social problem for us to try to solve. And so what this climate insurance report's main goal is to break that feedback loop. How do we create the policies and approaches that can strengthen our pre-disaster mitigation, and especially invest in nature-based solutions? And I want to sort of close up my opening comments here with a few points on that. In the long term, this working group determined that community-based approaches, nature-based approaches can be really effective when compared with sort of property by property or business by business risk reduction. And so the degree to which insurance can focus in on how do you invest in wetlands and urban forests to reduce the risks before they occur, how do you link that to insurance policies and communicate to policyholders that information so that they can invest in their local solutions, becomes a really big part of climate resilience in the future. Because at a certain level, where is this risk information being held? Governments have some risk information, insurance companies have some risk information, and we need to have opportunities for those entities to be able to share information, merge together, and take on solutions. And so the report does recommend several proof of concept projects to say, let's take risk reduction and risk transfer ideas and merge them together and test how well an investment in wetlands is going to reduce the flooding risks in those areas. And I think that those proof of concept projects, whether they occur in Canada around Ottawa or in California around Sacramento, are going to help all of us really focus in on how insurance can strengthen adaptation. So thanks very much, Butch.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I know that report has 40 plus recommendations. Can you just highlight to me what you would be very personally keen to see as a recommendation there? That what are some of your favorite recommendations that you really want to get crystallized? Because this is a here and now question. Before, climate change was always a tomorrow discussion. Now it's a here and now discussion. So what do you want to make happen immediately, Mike, out of those 40 recommendations?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Butch. It's hard to prioritize the 40 recommendations, right? They're all my favorite. But I in response to your question, I think that's been very dramatic and legitimately publicized just the degree of fire risk in California. But I think what the report really hits in on is that there are three major risks that we're trying to address: fire, extreme heat, and flooding. And so I would really like to see some community-based insurance pilots on extreme heat and flooding so that we sort of are able to build out and have a more comprehensive solution in California. Because, we do have, I think, the report identifies very few people with any flood insurance, yet we have atmospheric rivers. And as we've seen in the last 2 summers, especially, extreme heat is a deadly threat. And so if we could have a couple of these pilots recommended in the report that invest in urban forests and wetlands and merge it with some community-based insurance, that would be a really exciting and I think rewarding proof of concept coming out of the report.
Thanks, Mike. So we have around 16 minutes left. So the way we want to engage the audience and also engage the panel is we have several online polls. I would love to be able to do all three. So let's get going with the first one. The first online poll is about risk reduction. So this is a lot what Mandy and everyone was saying earlier. And so the question goes, setting aside insurance products and solutions, which risk management activity by insurers is the most impactful in building climate resilience communities? Unfortunately, you can only choose one. So, but we just want to have a sample of what people are thinking there. Is it A, carrying out climate risk modeling and scenario analysis? B, promoting climate-related risk reduction measures like flood control or drainage systems? Three, is it about promoting climate disaster preparedness plans? So when disasters do happen, you want communities to be ready. Or, or D, is it the industry advocating for climate resilient building codes and standards? Or E, is it advocating for climate resilient land use planning? So all of those things actually were touched on by our panelists, but it would be great to see what people are thinking on that. And these are all activities that insurers are doing beyond the provision of insurance coverage. Um, so hopefully we have gotten some votes. I could not see them, so I'm relying on my colleague to actually show the results. I hope you can. The results are coming in. Mandy, can you see them? I hope. Not yet.
No.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I know that there's a lag of 30 seconds from the time we show the poll. But okay. So I can see now that the results are saying 33% on B, C, and E. All right. So there seems to be like direct risk reduction measures, preparedness plans, and building codes. Obviously, scenario analysis is part of the value proposition of insurers. A lot of that is used into in-house modeling, but could also be done for communities. But it seems like there is a recognition that there's a bunch of these things taken together that could be quite helpful in building resilience. So that's one. Since we're already on this platform, why don't we look at take the second one and let's see how far we can go, and then we'll ask Mandy and the others to comment after the second poll. Why don't we look at the second poll so that if you're already there, we can see what you're thinking. The second one is, do nature-based solutions represent a major business opportunity for insurers writing North American business? So this one is quite simple. You simply have to say it is either yes or no. And some people may think it's maybe, and some people may think it's I don't know. So the question again is simply about nature-based solutions like wetlands, urban forests, rural forests. Um, um, which buffer storm surge, for example, and also are useful for flood control. For insurers, is this a major business opportunity for those who write business in North America? So let's see whether your votes how they stack up compared to what Mike and the others have said about nature-based solutions. Again, I'm gonna rely on my colleague to show the results when they are in. I think we're still waiting for them, but I'm quite curious to see what people are thinking about nature-based solutions, because that has been on the agenda for the past few years. And as you can see, California is talking about it. Mandy was talking about it. The same with Moira. And I know it's a key opportunity that has been flagged. But let's see what people are thinking about that, and then we'll see. Let's let the panel react afterwards. So if we can look at the results, that would be great. I hope that's simple enough to understand. Okay, so there's a bit of a technical issue, I think, but in case it's available, it would be great to see those results. But let's go back to the panel. Maddie, there seems to be on the voting on the first one on risk reduction measures, seems like everything is important. How do you start prioritizing those risk reduction measures? Because seems like everything has to be done in one go. And it's a good problem to have, that you know that all of these things are important, but how do you start making sense out of that, especially if some of them the insurers can do themselves directly, like modeling and implement incentivized risk reduction measures. The others are really advocacy work on how governments can do. So what is the strategy at Intact to make those work?
It's a great question, because you're bang on. There's just an incredible amount of opportunity in front of us, and where is it that we start? And Intact is a very much a data-driven company, like many insurers are. And so for us, it was originally a response to the fact that we had an unprofitable line of business in the early part of the last decade, where the board was asking, our CEO, Charles Bindamore, and saying, should we be even in the personal property business? Is there an opportunity for us in here? And that's because we built our personal property business primarily around fire, when flood was actually the primary peril. And 40% of our claims now are surrounded by flood, which forced us to, take a look at our property business model, on how we're looking at product design, claims, pricing, how we're managing our supply chain. And with that, and Mike, I thought, fantastic examples in terms of local kind of community insurance products. We introduced Overland Water product in 2015 as a result of that review. And now personal property is one of our, fastest growing business lines as a business, because we took the data that was in front of us and assessed, where is the impact happening? And then what do we do to be able to start to mitigate that? So from there, we really took a look at our external environment and saying, okay, we know that this is happening. What are the concrete solutions that we need to operationalize, not only within our business, but within society as well? And that's when we took, a bit of a hybrid approach of our expertise and our philanthropic capital to be able to establish the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, which is really focused on, practical research and applied research on resilience measures that I referred to earlier. And so for us, it's been very much there is certainly an order of go, as you've kind of heard through taking a look at our core business, using data-driven approach to make transformational changes and then apply that to society. But we're just at such a critical point right now where we're investing just an incredible amount of resources to mobilize all of these different dimensions at once, whether it's, government mobilization, using our expertise to help shape, what governments are thinking about in this space. The insurance industry is experts at physical risk. This is what we do. This is why we're here. And we want to be able to, take that expertise, there is already, a significant amount of data. And Mike, you've kind of alluded to this in your talk. There is a significant amount of data out there. I'm just not entirely confident governments are, fully understanding the opportunity that's in front of them, and how to use this data. And that's where we can come in to help them connect the dots on that front. But in terms of prioritization for us, probably not the greatest answer, because for us, we're trying to do all of these different dimensions at once, because we see it as just an integral part of not only our business strategy, but also our social impact strategy.
That's great, Mandy. Thank you so much. I really want to, I'm quite disappointed that technology failed us today on nature-based solutions. Moira, do you want to just answer that question? Do you think that nature-based insurance solutions is a major business opportunity for the insurance industry writing business in North America?
Sure, I'll answer it for everybody with a resounding yes on so many different dimensions. And since Mandy's so ably taking the lead on talking about the general insurance aspects, maybe I'll just focus a little bit on the opportunities for life and health. So I think all of us saw during the pandemic that green spaces in our communities became utilized to an extent never before seen, overutilized. They were absolutely crucial to our physical health and to our mental health. And there's also becoming a growing understanding as we're starting to get more information about the effects of existing climate change on life and health issues, that green spaces, natural infrastructure are also critical to our emotional and physical well-being and connecting into insurance that can be provided to support those. So heat islands are created by cities that are predominantly concrete. If we can use green roofs, green walls, more parks, put gardens where we've got concrete, all of these things will help bring down temperatures as well as help with mental health of citizens. I also want to touch a little bit on what both Mike and Mandy said. So Mandy mentioned lots of data. Not all of it is usable for consumers or for governments, and the role that insurers can play in helping make that connection to what these realms and realms of climate data that nobody can keep track of. But what does it mean for you specifically as a government decision maker, and what does it make for you as a consumer in the choices that you make, whether to put in a backwater valve, how you do your landscaping? So there's an incredible role that we can play in making meaning of all this climate data. And I also want to go back to a point that Mike made about the proof of concept. I think it's incredibly useful to work at the community level and to drive solutions together to get this usable data. Let's face it, information coming from large corporations to consumers is not always the data that you rush to believe first. You look at what your friends say, you look at what your social media say, but information and approaches that you collaboratively come up with in your community are things that people will action and that will make a difference. And I think that's an area that we could focus on more and drive consumer changes and also create markets for things like resilient building materials, where people right now may not care so much about them and they're not requesting them from builders or from suppliers.
Thank you so much, Moira. I'm just getting the results now also of the votes. So on the nature-based solutions, 50% said yes, it's a major business opportunity. 50% also said I don't know. So at least it's tilting towards that. No one said it's no. No one said it's maybe. It's either 50% yes and 50% I don't know. So I think that's a really good momentum towards what we're discussing there. And on the last question on the protection gap, I think a lot of people are saying that designing the products that are easy to understand are important. And also points to what Moira was saying, expanding coverage to include individuals typically not covered. So there's a very strong life and health agenda there. So we have 1 minute and 45 seconds. So I just want everyone on the panel, quick 10-second, last second, final word to share. What do you think is the best way to close the protection gap? So that's the third question, but I want to end on that note. Let's start with Mike.
I'll be quick. I think that the community-based approach is critical to closing the protection gap rather than the property by property. But I think that ultimately, governments have decisions to make over how to mitigate. And the more we can focus on things like wetlands, we're going to have gains on emissions and gains on risk reduction. And I think that that's a really cost-effective way to move forward.
Great. How about you, Moira? So we have 54 seconds, so please consume 10 to 20 seconds.
I think we need to change the way we look at approving our projects internally to include a social lens that is fully incorporated when we're looking at what the economic benefits of a particular project might be.
Thank you. And Mandy, over to you.
Sure. Well, we've learned a lot over the past year, especially for consumers, that there's an increased focus on value for money, ease of access, and digital engagement. And I think insurers have a real opportunity to leverage that digital engagement to develop and prioritize low cost, low price solutions that are focused on protecting essential assets.
Thank you so much. And for me, I would just add a lesson that I've learned over the years working with the insurance industry, which is very simple. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Thank you so much, and keep going. And we look forward to the next time to engage with you in helping build resilient communities. Thank you to all of you.
Nous venons d'assister à une section fort pertinente sur un secteur ô combien stratégique face aux enjeux climatiques pour les années à venir. Thanks to the speaker for sharing the insightful thoughts on the matter.